This is part one of a two-part video comparing the American Standard Version to the English Standard Version, which are two translations of the Bible into English. Part one will begin with background information and end with a discussion of how literal the two translations are. Part two will begin at the bullet, "The ESV is sometimes easier to understand." The background slide comes next. The American Standard Version is a mild revision of the English Revised Version of 1885. The American translators proposed a number of changes to the Revised Version. They hoped that the English revisers would adopt their suggestions so that a separate American edition would not be needed. As it turned out, the Revised Version simply published a list of readings preferred by the American team, but kept their own text intact. The American Standard Version Old Testament is largely based on the Masoretic Hebrew text, but sometimes translators chose to follow an ancient translation. For instance, at 1 Samuel 27:10, the American Standard Version follows the Septuagint and the Vulgate in having Achish say, "Against whom have ye made a raid today?" instead of the Masoretic reading, "Ye have not made a raid today, have ye?" Incidentally, the Revised Version and the American Standard Version translate 1 Samuel 27:10 differently. In the New Testament, the Revised Version and its American counterpart do not follow any specific Greek edition. As we will see, the translators diverged from Westcott and Hort's 1881 Greek New Testament on many occasions. Essentially, they did their own textual criticism, and to depart from the reading presumed to underlie the King James Version required a 2/3 vote. The English Standard Version is a revision of the Revised Standard Version of 1971. Like the American Standard Version, it is based on the Masoretic Hebrew in the Old Testament. It also follows ancient versions sometimes, and of course the Dead Sea Scrolls were available to the English Standard Version translators. When the American Standard Version was published, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was still 46 years in the future. The English Standard Version New Testament is based on the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, but as we'll see in a few slides, the translators did not feel bound to follow it in all cases. The two translations we'll compare are related to each other. They're both in the line of translations that go back to Tyndale's 1526 edition of the New Testament. The Revised Standard Version is a revision of the American Standard Version, and the English Standard Version is a revision of the Revised Standard Version. The relationship is like that of a grandparent to a grandchild. So now we'll proceed to an overview of the more prominent differences between the two translations. One thing you'll notice quickly when you examine the American Standard Version Old Testament is that it incorporates a 19th century guess for how to pronounce the Tetragrammaton. By that, I mean that you'll see the name Jehovah used in place of Yahweh or the Lord. There are in-text headings in the English Standard Version, but you'll not find them in the American Standard Version. The American Standard Version has long paragraphs, which were much more common in the 19th century than now. The English Standard Version uses what we Americans call quotation marks to enclose quotations. The American Standard Version does not. The American Standard Version employs the italic font for words not present in the original, but which the translators supplied to smooth out the sense of the passage. The English Standard Version does not. Finally, the American Standard Version does not consistently use the Granville Sharp rule. What does that mean? In the interest of time, I'll simply show the definition here. Two examples will appear on the next chart. This chart compares the two translations in Titus 2:23 in the first row and in 2 Peter 1:1 in the second. The English Standard Version and many other modern English translations make it clear that Christ is God and Savior. The American Standard Version leaves Christ's deity unclear in these verses, since it implies that two persons, God and Christ, are in view. The American Standard Version's footnotes, at least, suggest Christ's deity. Even before a reader spots Jehovah in the Old Testament, he or she may become aware that the American Standard Version employs antiquated English. The American Standard Version uses language like that in the King James and older versions, replete with these, thous, hasts, and haths. It also retains a number of words no longer commonly used in American English, like fain and sottish, and a few words that have changed their meanings, like pulse. Pulse here means a dish of beans, peas, or lentils. By contrast, the English Standard Version is in Standard Modern English. It seems somewhat formal when compared with more recent translations, such as the New International Version and the Christian Standard Bible. In the next few charts, we'll see examples of where the American Standard Version's distinction between first-person singular and plural pronouns can prove helpful. Our first example is from John 1:51. In the verses immediately preceding John 1:51, Jesus and Nathanael have been speaking to each other, but here, while continuing to address Nathanael, Jesus begins to speak to a larger group. The difference is obvious in the American Standard Version, which switches from thee and thou to you and ye, but the English Standard Version requires a footnote to signal the reader there's been a switch. In Acts 5:8-9, the American Standard Version's use of ye makes it plain that Peter means both Ananias and Sapphira. The English Standard Version places a footnote beside the first you because, in the context, we expect the word you to be singular, since Peter is addressing Sapphira alone. For the second you, the ESV editors must have thought the use of the phrase agreed together was sufficient to indicate that it was plural. These two ASV versus ESV videos concentrate on the New Testament, but in the next few charts we'll look at a few examples of where the two translations differ in the Old Testament, primarily due to the fact that the English Standard Version translates material from the Dead Sea Scrolls rather than the Masoretic text. Under this heading, we'll also see instances where the English Standard Version departs from the Masoretic text to follow ancient translations, like the Septuagint or Vulgate. Here in Deuteronomy 32:8, the American Standard Version translates the Masoretic text as the children of Israel, but the English Standard Version has sons of God. Where did that come from? The English Standard Version is following a scroll found in Cave 4 at Qumran, Scroll J of Deuteronomy. The reading from the Septuagint is similar. It has angels of God. Next, take a look at Deuteronomy 32:43. There are a number of changes here, but we'll focus on the ones in red to save time. The phrases, bow down to him, all gods, and he repays those who hate him. The reading bow down to him, all gods, comes from a different scroll found in the fourth cave at Qumran, the Q scroll this time. It's interesting to see how similar the Dead Sea Scroll reading is to the Septuagint, which has, and let all the angels of God worship him. The author of the book of Hebrews quotes the Septuagint's reading in Hebrews 1:6. The words, he repays those who hate him, are from the same scroll. Again, they back up the Septuagint. Here in Isaiah 21:8, we see a striking difference between the American Standard Version and the English Standard Version. The ASV would have someone cry out the way a lion cries out. The ESV, following a Dead Sea Scrolls reading, has, "He who saw cried out." The ESV reading is based on the Great Isaiah Scroll, and it seems to make more sense here. Apparently, a translation into Syriac supports the Dead Sea Scroll reading. Isaiah 21:8 was the last Dead Sea Scroll example I chose to include in this video. You can see a few other instances where the ESV follows a Dead Sea Scroll reading by viewing part 1 of my KJV versus ESV video. Earlier in this video, I mentioned an example where the American Standard Version follows the Septuagint and the Vulgate instead of the Masoretic Hebrew, 1 Samuel 27:10. In 1 Samuel 10, verse 1, the ESV follows the Septuagint in supplying additional material for Samuel's speech at Saul's anointing. Notice that the words "anointed you to be prince" appear twice in the ESV's version of the passage. These words appear both just before the material in blue and at the end of it. It seems probable that a scribe skipped over the intervening material because of this repetition. Here in 1 Samuel 14:41, we find a relatively lengthy insertion from the Latin and Greek translations into the ESV. The ESV's parent, the Revised Standard Version, had a propensity to depart from the Masoretic text, and it did so here in 1 Samuel 14:41. The ESV simply follows the RSV here. I show here the same verse in Richard Challoner's 1752 revision of the Douay Rheims Bible, which is based on an edition of the Latin Vulgate. As you can see, Jerome, or one of his revisers, I say one of his revisers because I'm not sure how close the Douay Rheims is to the original Vulgate here, or one of his revisers translated Urim and Thummim with Latin words that equate to proof and holiness. The New English translation of the Septuagint uses clear ones and holiness respectively. While preparing these videos, I came across an interesting phenomenon in English translations of Job chapter 13, verse 15. I placed this chart here, even though it's really not related to the Dead Sea Scrolls or ancient translations like the Septuagint. Since it's an Old Testament passage, it fit here better than anywhere else. Notice how the two translations on the left depict Job as hopeful, while those on the right have him expressing despair. I'm no Hebrew scholar, so I don't have an opinion on which translation is correct. I will note that the ESV provides the RSV's translation in a footnote, while the ASV's footnote at this spot is similar to the KJV. The NET Bible sides with the KJV and ESV. It attributes the differences in translations to a distinction between the way the pre-Masoretic consonantal Hebrew is written and the way it should be pronounced. At this point, we transition to the New Testament. I'll show a few examples of where the ESV and ASV differ because the Greek texts they translate also differ. But I'll first say a few words about the Greek text underlying each. One often hears that the Revised Version was based on Westcott and Hort's 1881 Greek New Testament, and it is true that the translators had access to that Greek text prior to its publication. It's also true that Fenton Hort was a vocal and persuasive member of the Revised Version's New Testament Committee. But the Revised Version translators did their own textual criticism as they went along, as they noted in section 3 of the preface to the edition of AD 1881. The ASV is a light revision of the Revised Version. I show here a few examples of where the ASV differs from Westcott and Hort's 1881 Greek New Testament. These differences were simple to locate. I simply examined marginal notes in the ASV that began with words like "some ancient authorities read." Then I compared the reading in the text to the reading in Westcott and Hort. Perhaps the most significant examples here are Luke 22:43 through 44, where the American Standard Version retains the account of the angel's appearance to Jesus on the Mount of Olives, and Christ's agony in the garden, and a portion of Luke 24:51, which describes Christ's ascension into heaven. In all of the cases I show, the American Standard Version retained the reading from the King James Version. Recall that the Revised Version's Translation Committee required a 2/3 majority to overturn a reading presumed to underlie the authorized version. Two of the most significant passages omitted by Westcott and Hort are Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, and the story of the woman taken in adultery, which begins in John 7:53. Both of these passages are included in the American Standard Version. John 7:53 through 8:11 is enclosed in single square brackets, accompanied by a note that casts doubt on its authenticity. The longer ending of Mark has no brackets in the ASV, but it also carries a note that suggests it is not original. Although the ESV is based on the 28th edition of the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament, the translators sometimes chose to depart from it. As the ESV preface states, in a few difficult cases in the New Testament, the ESV followed a Greek text different from the text given preference in UBS 5 and in A28. UBS 5 is the United Bible Society's 5th edition, which contains the same Greek text as the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. Like the ASV, the ESV includes Luke 22:43 through 44 in defiance of NA28. Perhaps the most interesting difference is at 2 Peter 3:10, where the ESV follows an earlier edition of the Nestle-Aland text and ignores NA28 completely. NA28 omits Mark 16:9 through 20 and John 7:53 through 8:11. The ESV includes both in double square brackets, accompanied by notes that cast doubt on their authenticity. Now we'll move along to a few examples of where the ESV and ASV differ because they translate different Greek texts. In the 8th chapter of Paul's epistle to the Romans, the ASV says that Christ was raised from the dead, while the ESV says that he was raised and leaves it at that. Westcott and Hort included "from the dead," but enclosed the phrase in single square brackets to indicate that it is doubtful. The words "ek nekron" are included in codices Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus, but are absent from P27 apparently, P46, which are both papyri, Codex Vaticanus, and the majority of manuscripts. Deleting "from the dead" seems to be a trend in modern English translations. The Revised Standard Version included "from the dead" in the text, but the 1989 New Revised Standard Version deleted that phrase. Similarly, the 1970 New English Bible included it, but the 1989 Revised English Bible eliminated it. The 1966 Jerusalem Bible and the 1985 New Jerusalem Bible included "from the dead," while the 2018 Revised New Jerusalem Bible removed those words. Unlike Westcott and Hort, the Nestle-Aland 28th edition omits "from the dead." In his book, Early Manuscripts and Modern Translations of the New Testament, Philip Comfort wondered why all translations didn't drop "from the dead." He noted that the RSV translators in particular had access to the papyri P27 and P46, and usually revised the ASV when presented with earlier and reliable evidence. Perhaps the translators of the American Standard Version, Revised Standard Version, and so forth went beyond the text at this point, and they, as with so many scribes, thought it necessary to fill out the expression, whom he raised, with the usual formula, from the dead. In Romans 15, verse 1, the American Standard Version reads, Holy Spirit, while the English Standard Version has Spirit of God. Westcott and Hort included holy here in the text, but enclosed it in single square brackets to indicate that it is doubtful. That word is included in codices Alexandrinus and Claromontanus, and in the Latin-based Douay Rheims version. Nestle-Aland 28 reads Spirit of God, but it encloses of God in single square brackets to indicate those words are doubtful. The Papyrus P46, Codex Sinaiticus, the majority of manuscripts, and Lamb's translation of the Syriac read Spirit of God. As with Romans 8:34, the change here brings the ESV closer to the King James Version, which also reads Spirit of God. The move from Holy Spirit to Spirit of God appears to have been motivated by the reading in Papyrus P46 and to have become common by the 1980s, perhaps due to the publication of the Nestle-Aland 26th edition in 1979. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 22, the choice is between the ASV's love one another from the heart and the ESV's love one another from a pure heart. This appears to be another instance where the reading in modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament has been influenced by the discovery of a papyrus manuscript, in this case P72. NA28 includes pure in the text, marked by the diamond of uncertainty, and it cites P72 and Codex Sinaiticus as among other witnesses in support of it. Codices Alexandrinus and Vaticanus omit the word pure. The Tyndale Greek New Testament includes pure in its text. The 1946 and 1971 Revised Standard Versions both omit pure, as does the 1989 New Revised Standard Version. The 2018 New Revised Jerusalem Bible also omits pure, as does the 2011 New International Version. The ESV has included pure in this verse since its first edition in 2001. The NET Bible also includes pure, as does the King James Version. In Jude 5, the American Standard Version says that the Lord saved a people out of Egypt, but the ESV replaces the Lord with Jesus. Jesus saved a people out of Egypt. When the Nestle-Aland's 28th edition was published in 2012, it moved from the Lord to Jesus, here in Jude 5. Some say that the ESV text changed to follow NA28, but I've seen no evidence of that. In fact, every copy of the ESV I own, including one published in 2002, and several that carry the words ESV Text Edition 2007 on the copyright page, read Jesus here. Remember that the NA28 was published in 2012, 5 years after the 2007 ESV. Some may recommend the ESV be revised to bring it into line with the NA28. In my opinion, since textual criticism is not an exact science, the ASV reading here is fine the way it is. Now let's take a look at Revelation chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. I've highlighted two differences, sing versus sang, and reign versus shall reign. Concerning sing versus sang, in both Westcott and Hort and NA28, the Greek word is in the present tense. A literal translation is sing, as in the ASV. If you own a copy of the New American Standard Bible, you can verify this. The asterisk next to sang indicates that the verb is actually in the present tense. But with regard to reign versus shall reign, here we have a difference in the underlying Greek. Westcott and Hort reads reign, while NA28 reads shall reign. The NET Bible describes the choice between the two readings as difficult, but it concludes that, quote, all things considered, there is a slight preference for the future, unquote, tense, shall reign. Alexandrinus supports the present tense, reign, but it also mistakes reign for shall reign in Revelation 20, verse 6. Because of that, says Metzger in his textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, a majority of the Nestle-Aland Committee preferred the future tense. To modify the American Standard Version to bring it into line with the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, a number of other changes would have to be made. I note a few of them here on this slide, but as I said before, I'm not convinced that there's a real need. Textual criticism is not an exact science, and textual scholars often disagree on which reading is better. Notice here the number of places where the Tyndale House Greek New Testament supports the American Standard Version translators' choices against those chosen by the Nestle-Aland 28th edition committee. We'll transition now to the final discussion topic for Part 1, the question of how literal the two translations are. We'll first look at a few passages by way of example. Then I'll show where the ESV and the ASV stand in my Translation Continuum chart. Our first example comes from Romans chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. This passage is from the introductory section of the book of Romans. We'll turn first to the first difference, marked in blue. The Greek word translated unto, or to bring about, is eis, which can indicate a goal. But the ESV's, quote, to bring about, unquote, a translation that goes back to the 1946 Revised Standard Version, seems to mark Paul's apostleship as the sole cause of that obedience. Unto, or the King James Version's for, are better here because they are less specific. In the next verse, quote, among whom ye are ye also, unquote, is closer to the Greek. The ESV conveys the meaning with including you who are, though it neglects the Greek word the ASV translates as also. The final phrase is literally called of Jesus Christ, which certainly the 1946 Revised Standard Version's to belong to, which the ESV repeats, is the most likely meaning in this context, but the lack of italics prevents the reader from considering other possibilities. The second example is Matthew chapter 10, verse 41. This passage is set among the Lord's instructions to his 12 apostles, whom he sent out to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This verse contains expressions in Greek that are literally rendered in the name of. The 1946 Revised Standard Version assisted the reader by interpreting the expression as because he is, and the ESV let the RSV's interpretation stand in the text. In this regard, some newer translations follow the Revised Standard Version, including the recent Evangelical Heritage Version, or EHV. But the new Revised Standard Version reverted to the traditional in the name of. David Bentley Hart understood in the name of a prophet to mean because he is called prophet. The 2011 New International Version has whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet, which is ambiguous. Does as a prophet refer to the prophet or to the one who welcomes him? In other words, does it mean whoever welcomes a prophet the way a prophet should be welcomed, or does it mean whoever, while acting in a prophet-like manner, welcomes a prophet? The Revised New Jerusalem Bible agrees with the New International Version. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 30 is set in Paul's criticism of the manner in which the Corinthian church celebrated the Eucharist. The Greek reads sleep. It could come into English as some sleep or as many sleep. The verb is in the present tense. The English Standard Version translates, "and some sleep," with "and some have died," and so explains the euphemism. Both the literal rendering "sleep" and the explanation "have died" or "are dead" are popular in modern translations. Here are a few examples. Returning to Romans, we'll briefly examine a verse in a passage in which Paul contrasts Adam to Christ. We'll focus on the material that the ASV prints in italic type. The ASV is much more literal here. By employing italic type, it shows the reader material not present in the Greek, but which was supplied by the translators to make sense of the passage. The material not in italics in the American Standard Version is a word-for-word rendering of the Greek text into English. The English Standard Version misleads the reader into thinking that the words "led to condemnation" and "leads to" are as sure as "one trespass" or "one act of righteousness." But the ESV does provide helpful footnotes that suggest another way to read the passage, one reminiscent of the King James, the Bishop's Bible, the Geneva Bible, and Tyndale. In that older approach, instead of "one trespass," read "the trespass of one," that is, one person's trespass, instead of "one trespass." In Luke 12:35, the English Standard Version reads, "stayed rest for action," while the American Standard Version has, "let your loins be girded about." The American Standard Version is quite literal here, but the English Standard Version places an explanation in the text, perhaps due to a concern over readability. A more literal rendering is provided in the footnote. In this instance, the ESV is less literal than its parent, the Revised Standard Version. The Revised Standard Version reads, "let your loins be girded and your lamps burning." The ESV may have been influenced by the New International Version, which has, "be dressed ready for service and keep your lamps burning." But the NIV could have been influenced in turn by the Jerusalem Bible, which reads, "see that you are dressed for action and have your lamps lit," or by the New English Bible, which has, "be ready for action with belts fastened and lamps alight." In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, Paul reminds Timothy that they have a holy calling in accordance with God's purpose and grace. Here again, the English Standard Version is somewhat less literal than the American Standard Version. We'll begin with the words marked in red. The Greek participle the American Standard Version translates with "was given" is, in fact, passive, so the ASV is more literal. The ESV follows the 1946 Revised Standard Version in making an active "he gave." The New Revised Standard Version reverted to the traditional and more literal passive form here. Next, take a look at the words marked in blue before times eternal in the American Standard Version, but before the ages began in the English Standard Version. The ASV's "before times eternal" is somewhat literal, but David Bentley Hart's "before the times of the ages" is perhaps more so. The Greek phrase is chronon ionion. The word chronon means periods of time, while ionion means ages or eternity. Both are genitive, and is a pronoun meaning before, so before times of ages or before times of eternity. Rather than attempt a literal rendering, the ESV gives a plausible explanation of what the phrase means. It's interesting to see how various translations deal with this curious Greek expression. "Before time began" seems to be quite popular with the translators. These examples demonstrate that the ESV is not as literal as it could be. I showed several other examples in part 2 of my King James Version versus English Standard Version video. But examples can be cherry-picked, so I wanted to show this slide. It presents the results of my analysis of 18 translations. To avoid bias, I selected 200 verses using a random number generator and scored what I call liberties, places where the translations departed from a literal rendering. The American Standard Version is the most literal translation I scored, and even so, it contained well over 100 liberties in 200 verses. The English Standard Version comes in 5th place with over 300 liberties. Please note that literalness as I define it is not the same as accuracy, at least not the way I understand accuracy. An accurate translation is one that conveys the author's intended meaning into the target language. I imagine that one could do that and commit quite a few liberties along the way. To avoid giving the impression that the American Standard Version is always more literal than the English Standard Version, I want to show you John 12, verse 2. This verse is from the passage that describes how Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, anointed the Lord's feet with expensive ointment. As the ASV footnote points out, the Greek word the ASV translates as sat actually means to recline. But the ASV scores a point by representing a Greek conjunction with and, shown here in purple, that the ESV leaves out. Would you say that and Martha served is more accurate than Martha served? We'll break the video here. Part 2 will focus on differences between the American Standard Version and the English Standard Version in the New Testament that have little to do with the underlying Greek. Thanks for watching, and remember to like this video, if you do like this video, and to subscribe to the channel.